Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the economic storm that led to the Great Depression, arguably one of the most misunderstood collapses in modern history. What if I told you the crash of 1929 wasn't just some unlucky market event, but the inevitable consequence of a decade-long experiment in cheap money, booming credit, and euphoric delusion? Let's rewind to the Roaring Twenties, a period that seemed like prosperity but was quietly laying the groundwork for disaster. After World War I, the United States stepped onto the world stage as the new financial heavyweight. Europe was buried under mountains of war debt and destruction, while America had factories humming, banks flush with capital, and investors ready to lend. Capital flowed in from all directions, chasing opportunity in this post-war powerhouse. And from the outside, it all looked like a golden age. Skyscrapers rose, automobiles multiplied, and jazz bands played the soundtrack of an unstoppable decade. But beneath that glittering surface, something was brewing, something far more fragile. Enter the Federal Reserve. Created only a few years earlier in 1913, the Fed had grown comfortable with a certain kind of experimentation. Throughout the 1920s, it kept interest rates unusually low, trying to stimulate lending and investment. And boy, did it succeed. Credit exploded. Businesses borrowed to expand. Consumers borrowed to buy. And speculators? They borrowed to gamble. A boom was on, and it felt unstoppable. But here's the catch: when interest rates are kept artificially low, not by natural market forces, but by central policy, you distort the signals that guide smart investment. It's like turning off the smoke alarm in a burning house. Capital, instead of flowing into sustainable ventures, floods into whatever seems hot. In the 1920s, that meant the stock market. Investors piled in. Margin loans, borrowing money to buy stocks, became the norm. Why not? Prices kept rising, so everyone thought they were geniuses. But they weren't betting on real value. They were riding a wave of liquidity, a wave pushed by easy money and manipulated rates. And that brings us to one of the most overlooked problems of the decade: misallocated capital. Imagine a nation pouring its wealth into speculative bubbles while real economic imbalances go unnoticed. That's exactly what was happening. People thought they were building wealth, but much of it was just smoke and mirrors. So while America looked like a rising empire, the foundation was built on sand, on credit, on intervention, and on a belief that prosperity could be engineered by controlling money itself. And that's the stage we step onto, just before the curtain falls. Now let's talk about the moment the music stopped. The crash of 1929 is one of those historical moments that everyone's heard about, but very few actually understand. Was it just a bad day on Wall Street? A panic caused by fear? Or was it something deeper, something already broken long before the first shares plummeted? Let's be clear. October of 1929 was not the disease, it was the symptom. The visible collapse you saw in the newspapers was simply the bursting of a balloon that had been inflating for years. Underneath it all were systemic issues: warped credit markets, artificial growth, and a monetary policy that had been quietly rewiring the economy in dangerous ways. Now, depending on who you ask, you'll get very different explanations for what really caused the collapse. The Austrian school of economics points to a simple but powerful idea: when you flood an economy with artificially cheap credit, you set the stage for misinvestment. Businesses and individuals make decisions based on distorted signals. They borrow too much, expand too fast, or invest in things that only make sense in a low-rate environment. Eventually, reality hits. The party ends, and all those bad investments, what Austrians call malinvestment, have to be cleared out. It's not just a downturn, it's a necessary correction. In this view, the collapse wasn't random. It was baked into the system. The crash had to happen because the foundation was flawed. Monetary inflation had built a tower of illusions, and gravity finally took over. But then there's the Keynesian interpretation, which sees things differently. Keynesians argue that the crash didn't have to become a depression. What really failed, they say, was aggregate demand. Consumer spending collapsed. Confidence evaporated. People stopped buying, so businesses stopped hiring. It wasn't just the system that broke, it was the human psychology within it. The infamous animal spirits, as John Maynard Keynes called them, turned negative, and that spiral of fear and hesitation deepened the crisis. Two very different diagnoses, but here's where things get even more interesting. In the final stretch before the crash, the Federal Reserve suddenly changed course. After years of easy money, the Fed tightened credit in 1928. Why? Because speculation had gone too far. But that sudden contraction caught the market off guard. Investors who had borrowed heavily to buy stocks were suddenly exposed. Margin calls rolled in. Panic spread, and the house of cards collapsed faster than anyone imagined. So was it inevitable, as the Austrians would say? Was it psychological collapse, as the Keynesians argue? Or did the Fed, by trying to put the brakes on too late, just light the final match? Whatever the answer, one thing is clear: the crash didn't come out of nowhere. It was the unraveling of decisions made long before by banks, investors, policymakers, and an entire society that had fallen in love with the illusion of permanent growth. And now, that illusion was shattered. Now, if you've ever heard the classic narrative, you probably think President Herbert Hoover just sat on his hands while the country collapsed. That he was a do-nothing president who believed the market would fix itself and let the people fend for themselves. But here's the twist, that version of history? It's mostly wrong. Hoover wasn't passive. He was actually quite active. The real debate isn't whether he intervened, but whether his interventions helped or made things worse. Let's start with his interventionist legacy. Hoover pushed for wage supports, encouraged major businesses not to lay off workers, and launched large public works projects to spur employment. Sound familiar? It should. It's the early playbook of what would later become the New Deal. But Hoover did it first, albeit on a more limited scale. He also used tariffs, a decision that proved catastrophic. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 was meant to protect American industries by raising import duties. But instead of shielding the economy, it triggered a global trade war. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, and international trade contracted dramatically. Exports fell, jobs disappeared, and economic pain deepened across the globe. Then there's the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC. This wasn't some passive armchair policy. Hoover's RFC extended emergency credit to struggling banks and businesses, an early attempt at targeted bailouts. It was an active, if cautious, move to prop up key institutions before total collapse set in. So why do people still say Hoover did nothing? Because the scale of his interventions didn't match the size of the collapse. And to many, that looked like indifference. But here's where the economic schools start throwing punches again. Austrian economists argue that Hoover made things worse by interfering in the natural correction process. They believed his wage supports and business meddling prevented prices and employment from adjusting on their own. In their view, the cure, letting bad investments fail, was delayed by government meddling. Keynesians, on the other hand, argue the exact opposite, that Hoover didn't go far enough. He was too cautious, too concerned with budget balancing, and too slow to unleash the kind of large-scale public spending that could have jump-started demand. So, which is it? Was Hoover too hands-off, or too heavy-handed in the wrong direction? Either way, what we see is a president caught between two worlds, trying to hold the economy together without the tools or political consensus to go all in. His policies were bold for their time, but timid in hindsight, and they set the stage for the next chapter, one defined by even bigger interventions, sweeping reforms, and a fundamental reshaping of the American economic system. Now, let's shift our focus from the White House to the Federal Reserve. Between 1930 and 1933, while the nation was spiraling deeper into economic despair, over 9,000 banks collapsed. People lined up outside their banks in panic, hoping to withdraw their savings, only to find that their money was gone. Entire towns lost their financial lifelines overnight. Businesses failed, paychecks bounced, life savings evaporated. And what did the Federal Reserve do in the face of this banking bloodbath? Almost nothing. This was one of the most critical moments in economic history, and the Fed, the very institution created to manage crises, essentially froze. Fed inaction amid cascading bank failures meant that as banks collapsed, there was no lender of last resort stepping in to restore confidence or provide liquidity. The system needed a safety net. Instead, it got silence. Milton Friedman, one of the most influential voices of the monetarist school, would later argue that this was the moment when a bad recession became a full-blown depression. By shrinking the money supply and allowing deflation to run wild, the Fed didn't just fail to solve the crisis, it amplified it. In Friedman's view, if the Fed had acted decisively, injecting liquidity, supporting banks, it could have prevented years of misery. But the Austrian economists had a different take. For them, the collapse was the result of previous sins. The inflation-fueled bubbles of the 1920s, driven by cheap credit and distorted investment, had to burst eventually. And this banking crisis? That was the correction phase, the painful, but necessary, clearing of an economy built on false signals. To them, the issue wasn't that the Fed didn't act fast enough, it was that the Fed had intervened too much in the first place. Now, there's one more layer here that's easy to overlook, but crucial: the absence of a sound monetary anchor. At the time, the US was still nominally tied to the gold standard, but the adherence was inconsistent. Some banks operated under different rules. International flows of gold complicated the picture, and without a true foundation of monetary discipline or a free banking system, the entire financial architecture was fragile, rigid in some places, chaotic in others. It was like building a skyscraper on shifting sand, and then being shocked when it toppled in a storm. So we have a perfect storm, a fragile system, a panicked public, a shrinking money supply, and a central bank that blinked at the worst possible time. What followed was not just economic collapse, It was a crisis of trust, and it would open the door for a new kind of leadership, one that promised security, reform, and a bold new plan. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who didn't just promise change, he delivered it loudly, dramatically, and with a level of federal power the country had never seen before. Now, FDR's New Deal is often hailed as the savior of the American economy. And to be fair, it did transform the relationship between citizens and the federal government. But whether it rescued the economy, or redesigned it into something more dependent, is still up for debate. Let's start with the scale of centralization and control. Under the New Deal, agencies like the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, not the Rifle Group, mind you, and the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, sprang into existence. Social Security was introduced, business codes were written, prices were fixed, and the federal government became not just a referee in the economy, but a player, coach, and commissioner all at once. It was a massive shift from market-driven adjustment to centralized economic planning. Some saw this as necessary triage in a wounded system. Others saw it as the beginning of a new kind of bureaucracy, one where markets no longer told the truth, the government did. And if that wasn't bold enough, Roosevelt also took the unprecedented step of gold confiscation. In 1933, Executive Order 6102 required Americans to turn in their gold to the federal government. Just think about that for a second. Citizens were told to surrender their private property, under threat of fines or prison. Why? Because FDR needed to cut the dollars linked to gold and expand the money supply. It was a radical move that altered the very foundation of monetary policy and property rights. To some, this was strategic. To others, it was a seismic breach of economic liberty. Now the critiques come into focus. Austrian economists argue that the New Deal distorted price signals and misallocated resources. When government overrides the natural movement of prices, propping some up, forcing others down, it sends mixed messages to producers and consumers. It creates confusion, not clarity. And when political incentives guide economic decisions, resources get funneled toward what's popular, not what's productive. On the flip side, Keynesians saw the New Deal as essential. To them, the problem wasn't too much government, it was too little demand. People weren't spending, so the government had to. Public works, relief programs, and safety nets like Social Security were all designed to restore confidence, inject liquidity, and stabilize society. Without intervention, they argued, the economy might never have recovered at all. So here we are, one camp sees the New Deal as a bold lifeline, the other as a costly distortion. But either way, there's no denying the impact. The New Deal didn't just tweak the system, it re-engineered it. The federal government became a permanent fixture in economic life, shaping outcomes from the top down. Whether that saved America or shackled it is a question we're still answering. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. Because for all the fanfare, for all the sweeping reforms and alphabet agencies, the New Deal didn't produce a smooth path to recovery. In fact, it created a ripple effect of unintended consequences, some of which made the crisis worse, not better. Let's start with one of the biggest issues, regulatory uncertainty. Roosevelt's administration churned out rule after rule, code after code, and executive order after executive order. And while this was meant to bring stability, it often did the opposite. Business owners didn't know what would change next. Prices were being set by Washington. Labor rules were being rewritten by bureaucrats. Entrepreneurs were walking blindfolded through a minefield of evolving regulations. And when you don't know the rules of the game, or if the rules keep shifting, what do? You sit on your hands. You don't invest. You don't hire. You wait. And in that waiting, the economy stalls. Now, let's talk about unemployment, because here's something they don't teach you in school. Despite all the New Deal programs, unemployment remained high throughout the 1930s. Even by 1939, after a decade of intervention, the jobless rate was still in double digits. If the New Deal was such a success, why didn't the jobs come back? One reason? The very programs meant to help often interfered with natural recovery. Take the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, for example. In an effort to raise crop prices, the AAA actually paid farmers to destroy crops and slaughter livestock. Yes, while people were starving, the government was literally paying to throw food away. It was economic manipulation in its purest form, reduce supply to prop up prices, even if it meant waste on a national scale. But perhaps the most overlooked effect was on the civic and voluntary institutions that once formed the backbone of American resilience. Before the New Deal, mutual aid societies, churches, fraternal organizations, they all played a role in supporting people through hard times. These weren't just charitable efforts. They were decentralized, community-driven systems of support. But as the government expanded its role, those voluntary systems began to fade. Why rely on your neighbors when Washington was mailing checks? The safety net had shifted from local and voluntary to national and compulsory. And with that shift came a slow erosion of what some would call civil society, that rich ecosystem of bottom-up cooperation and responsibility. So yes, the New Deal changed everything. But not always for the better. It created jobs, yes, but often temporary and politically guided. It offered relief, but sometimes at the cost of long-term recovery. It promised security, but chipped away at the very self-reliance that had once defined the American spirit. The question isn't whether the New Deal did something, it's whether what it did helped or hurt the future it was trying to save. And now we arrive at one of the most persistent myths in American economic history. You've probably heard it before, maybe in a classroom, maybe in a documentary, that World War II ended the Great Depression. That it was the war, not any economic policy or market mechanism, that finally pulled the country out of crisis. But let's pump the brakes for a second and take a closer look. During World War II, the US government went into overdrive. Factories stopped making cars and started making tanks. Workers were pulled into defense plants. Millions of men were drafted into military service. Unemployment? It dropped. But not because private sector demand was booming. It dropped because people were removed from the labor force altogether, or shifted into war work that had little to do with consumer needs. And that's the key. Wartime production doesn't equal peacetime prosperity. Think about it. What good is a booming economy if you can't buy anything with it? During the war, consumer goods were scarce. Rationing was everywhere. You couldn't buy a new car, or much meat, or even enough rubber for your tires. People had jobs, sure, but they were producing weapons, not wealth. So was this real economic recovery? Or was it a kind of economic illusion, a distortion caused by central planning, forced labor reallocation, and massive government borrowing? Austrian economists would say the latter. In their view, the war didn't fix the economy, it just redirected it. It was a command economy, not a free one. Price signals were muted, competition was suspended, and consumer choice was almost non-existent. It was a temporary system held together by wartime urgency, not sustainable economic health. They argue that the real recovery came after the war, when government controls were lifted, soldiers returned home, and the private sector was allowed to reassert itself. When markets were once again free to allocate resources efficiently, that's when prosperity returned in full. Now, Keynesians might push back. They'd argue that the war mobilization demonstrated the power of massive fiscal stimulus, that when the government spends enough, it can create full employment and activate idle resources. In this light, the war proved Keynesian theory right, even if the spending was on tanks instead of housing. But here's the danger in that thinking. If we believe war is the best economic stimulus, we're opening the door to a very dark justification for conflict. That prosperity must be bought with bombs. That growth comes from destruction. And that's not just bad economics, it's a dangerous moral failure. So no, World War II didn't solve the Great Depression. It masked it. It suspended market dynamics, replaced them with government directives, and gave the illusion of full recovery. The real healing came later. When peace returned, controls were lifted, and people were free once again to build, buy, sell, and grow. The myth persists, but the truth, it tells a different story. Alright, time to step back and look at the two titans of economic thought that have been wrestling behind the scenes of everything we've discussed so far, the Austrian school and the Keynesian school. These aren't just academic disagreements, they represent two radically different ways of seeing the world, of understanding how economies work, how crises happen, and what governments should or shouldn't do about them. Let's start with how each side views crises themselves. Austrians believe crises are the result of artificial distortions in the economy, especially from things like central bank interventions and government manipulation of credit. When interest rates are pushed below their natural level, businesses start making decisions based on cheap money instead of actual consumer demand. That leads to malinvestment, money flowing into projects that only seem profitable under those fake conditions. Eventually, the house of cards falls, and the bust follows the boom. To them, the crisis is not a bug, it's a necessary correction. Keynesians, on the other hand, see crises as failures in demand. People stop spending, businesses cut back, and the economy enters a downward spiral. In their view, the government has a duty to step in, to spend when others won't, to fill the demand gap, and to stimulate confidence. A recession, they argue, is something to be fought, not endured. Now let's talk about capital and time, an area where the Austrian school shines in its complexity. Austrians emphasize the time structure of production. They see capital not as a lump sum, but as something spread out across time, factories, supply chains, stages of production. When interest rates are distorted, those time-sensitive structures get warped. Long-term investments might seem attractive when money is cheap, but they fall apart when reality kicks in. That's why Austrians are skeptical of easy money and centralized credit. They think it throws off the entire rhythm of the economy. Keynesians? They're less concerned with time structures. For them, The economy is more of a snapshot, focused on present flows, spending, income, output. Their priority is getting the gears turning again, often through short-term stimulus, even if it means borrowing heavily. They tend to believe the long run will sort itself out. Famously, Keynes once said, "In the long run, we are all dead." Now here's where it gets really spicy, the role of government. For Austrians, the government should act more like a referee, keeping the game fair, protecting property rights, but not playing on the field. They believe in decentralization, in letting millions of individuals make decisions based on local knowledge, and they warn that every intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, can lead to more distortions, more dependencies, and more fragility. Keynesians, meanwhile, argue that the government is uniquely positioned to correct market failures, stabilize the business cycle, and smooth out the rough patches of capitalism. In their model, top-down stimulus isn't dangerous, it's essential. But this raises a deeper philosophical question: do we trust spontaneous order or centralized control? Should recovery emerge from the bottom up or be managed from the top down? Neither side has all the answers, but by comparing them side by side, we begin to see what's really at stake, not just economic outcomes, but the very principles that shape how we organize society. And as we look back at history, we'll see which of these models held up better when put to the test. Now that we've unpacked the theory, let's return to the real world and ask the most important question of all. What does history actually show? Because it's one thing to argue models on paper. It's another to look at the messy, unpredictable outcomes of actual policies, lived decisions, and economic experiments. And here's what the historical record seems to suggest: the more aggressively central planners try to fix the economy from the top down, the more fragile, prolonged, or distorted the recovery tends to become. We saw this after the crash of 1929. Instead of allowing a swift correction and letting markets reallocate resources, policymakers doubled down on intervention. Price controls, gold confiscation, wage mandates, massive public spending, all with the hope of engineering recovery. But what followed was a decade of stagnation, with real unemployment remaining high, productivity growth stunted, and market signals scrambled by constant government interference. Now compare that with what happened after World War II. When the war ended, many feared another depression. After all, millions of soldiers were coming home, wartime spending was about to vanish, and government contracts were drying up. But guess what happened? Policymakers lifted controls. Markets were freed. Resources shifted naturally back to consumer production. And within a few short years, America experienced one of the greatest economic booms in its history. That wasn't the result of a new government program. It was the result of government stepping back. Over and over again, history presents this quiet but powerful lesson: when we trust decentralized decision-making, when we allow individuals and businesses to respond to real price signals, not political incentives, we get faster, healthier, and more sustainable growth. But this lesson is often ignored. Why? Because centralized control promises certainty. It promises action. It gives the illusion of mastery, that someone up top is steering the ship. But when that control fails, the damage is far-reaching. Markets lose trust. People lose agency. And entire generations can be trapped in stagnation. History isn't just about dates and events. It's about patterns. And the pattern we see, time and time again, is this: free systems recover, controlled systems drag. And when recovery finally comes, it usually comes not from a government directive, but from the quiet, unseen work of millions of people making voluntary choices that fit their unique circumstances. That's where real progress is born, not in the marble halls of Washington, but in the free and adaptive complexity of the market. So now we've come to the end of our journey, and it's time to step back and ask a bigger question. Who owns the future? Because this isn't just a story about the past. It's a story about the systems we choose, the trade-offs we accept, and the principles we hand off to the next generation. Throughout this video, we've seen a recurring theme: when crisis strikes, the instinct of centralized systems is to tighten control, to expand authority, and to promise safety in exchange for freedom. And yet time after time, those promises come with strings attached, long delays, distorted markets, fragile outcomes, and unintended consequences that ripple through society. But what if we've been asking the wrong question all along? Instead of asking, how can we fix the economy from the top? Maybe we should ask, what would happen if we simply got out of the way? What if recovery isn't something we engineer, but something we unleash? The Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek once warned against what he called the fatal conceit: the idea that planners and experts could ever possess enough knowledge to direct the spontaneous order of millions of lives. He argued that freedom, not control, was the only system resilient enough to adapt, evolve, and grow without permission, and history seems to back him up. The deeper truth is this: real recovery isn't imposed, it's discovered. It emerges from individual action, voluntary cooperation, and bottom-up experimentation. It requires humility, not hubris, flexibility, not rigidity, and trust, not in institutions, but in people. So, who owns the future? The bureaucrat? The central banker? The five-point plan? Or the entrepreneur who takes a risk? The family that opens a new store? The worker who learns a new skill? The future belongs to those who choose, not those who command. And that's the truth behind history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content that challenges the narrative and explores the ideas most textbooks leave out. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. You'll find the link in the description. It's packed with stories, suppressed truths, and lost lessons that shed light on how we got here and where we might be headed next. Thanks for watching. And remember, history isn't just what happened, it's what we learn from it.